I kind of frozen. It was amazing. Unexpected, and I thought, oh, wow, so much gold. What am I going to do? For thousands of years, Jerusalem has been a city wrapped in stone and mystery. Beneath its narrow streets and ancient walls lie layers of history, each one stacked upon the other like chapters in a book no one has finished reading. At its heart is the city of David, the small ridge where the story of Israel's greatest king was said to begin. The Bible tells us that King David conquered this fortress, turned it into his capital, and built a palace that stood as the seat of his power. But for centuries, archaeologists argued, was this real history or just a legend told to inspire scattered people? Dig after dig, why yielded fragments, walls, pottery tunnels, but no palace. Scholars concluded David was little more than a tribal chief, his so-called kingdom a glorified village. And then came Dr. Aote Mazar, born into a dynasty of archaeologists. She defied academic convention. Where others dismissed the Bible as myth, she read it as a map. Her quest was not just to find artifacts. It was to prove the stories written in Scripture had flesh, blood, and stone behind them. Before her death in 2021, she made a confession. She believed she had found the remains of King David's palace. Massive walls, clay seals bearing names straight out of Scripture, and a fortress that matched the Bible's description. To some, she was a visionary. To others, a dreamer chasing shadows. But what she revealed may be the closest we have ever come to uncovering the truth. Alat Mazar's story begins long before she ever picked up a trowel. Born in Jerusalem in 1956, she grew up surrounded by history, not just in the landscape of her city, but at her own family's dinner table. Her grandfather, Benjamin Mazar, was one of Israel's most respected archaeologists, credited with groundbreaking excavations near the Temple Mount. His work shaped the very foundation of modern Israeli archaeology. For Isaac, history was never just dates and ruins. It was family tradition. From an early age, she showed an unusual fascination with the Bible. While most children read the stories of David and Goliath or Solomon's temple as fables, absorbed them as historical records waiting to be proven, she saw in them not just lessons of faith, but clues, geographical hints, architectural details, and narrative breadcrumbs that might lead to real places buried beneath her city. By the time she was a student, it was clear she would follow the same path as her grandfather. Yet, she also stood apart. In the academic world, relying on the Bible to guide excavations was controversial. Many scholars insisted that archaeology should be independent, guided by physical evidence alone. To them, biblical archaeology was a tainted phrase, a practice too easily colored by faith and politics. Disagreed. She believed the Bible was not merely spiritual literature, but a historical document, no different from Egyptian inscriptions or Assyrian tablets. To ignore it, she argued, was to throw away one of the most valuable records of the ancient Near East. Her conviction gave her both admirers and enemies. In lecture halls, she was often dismissed as naive. Colleagues muttered that she was chasing legends. But in the field, shovel in hand, she was relentless. For her, archaeology was not just a career. It was a mission to bridge the gap between Scripture and stone. That mission narrowed to one figure, King David. To Isaac, proving David's kingdom was real meant proving that the Bible's grand narratives were rooted in history, not myth. She wasn't looking for small finds. She wanted the palace, the beating heart of David's reign. If she could uncover that, it would be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the modern age. Others had tried and failed. But Isaac had something they lacked, the stubborn faith that the Bible itself held the directions. To understand Mazar's search, you have to understand the place she focused on, the city of David. Today, it is a narrow ridge just south of Jerusalem's old city, overshadowed by the gleaming Dome of the Rock and the walls built centuries later by Ottoman sultans. But in David's time around the 10th century BC, this ridge was Jerusalem. According to Scripture, it was originally a Jebusite stronghold thought to be impregnable. The locals mocked David and his men, boasting that even the blind and the lame could defend it. But the Israelites found a weakness, a water shaft that led from the Guhan spring into the city. By sneaking through this lifeline, David's men captured the fortress. From that day, it was known as the City of David, and from its heights, a kingdom began to spread. For archaeologists, the City of David has always been a magnet. In the 19th century, British explorer Charles Warren tunneled through its bedrock, mapping out the ancient water system, and identified what became known as Warren Shaft. His discoveries gave the first glimpse of how old Jerusalem really was. A century later, Kathleen Kenyon, one of the most renowned archaeologists of her time, dug into the same ridge. Her conclusion was devastating for biblical literalists. She argued Jerusalem in David's time was nothing more than a small hill village, no palace, no grand kingdom, just a modest settlement. Benjamin Mazar, Hilat's grandfather, also excavated in Jerusalem, but he focused his efforts closer to the Temple Mount. He revealed remarkable finds, but never uncovered the palace. By the early 2000s, the academic consensus was clear. If David existed at all, he was a minor chieftain. The glorious empire described in the Bible was an exaggeration written centuries later. The palace was a myth. But Mazar refused to accept that. She believed the problem wasn't that David's palace didn't exist. It was that archaeologists had been looking in the wrong place. To her, the answer was hidden in plain sight, buried in the very ridge where the story began. The City of David still held its secrets, and she was determined to uncover them. For years, archaeologists combed the City of David without finding a royal palace. Theories collapsed. Digs stalled and many gave up. But Isla let Mazar believed everyone was overlooking the obvious. Her guiding light was not an inscription, not a shard of pottery, but a single verse from the Bible. In the second book of Samuel 5:1, it reads, "And Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David and cedar trees and carpenters and masons, and they built David a house." To Mazar, this wasn't just poetic flourish. It was a blueprint. The verse revealed three important details. First, that David's palace was constructed with cedarwood, a Phoenician luxury material not native to Israel. Second, skilled foreign craftsmen were involved, meaning the building was of monumental scale. And third, that the palace was considered important enough to record in Israel's central historical text. If Tyrian builders came to Jerusalem, they would not have built a hut on a village hilltop. They would have constructed a monumental residence fit for royalty. That single verse convinced Mazar that David's palace must have been both real and extraordinary. Her next question was location. Where in the City of David would such a building stand? For her, the answer was clear. On the highest and most defensible point overlooking the city below. That place was the elevated ridge that connected the City of David to the Temple Mount. On that ridge stood the stepped stone structure, a massive man-made terrace of stone stacked into a hillside. Archaeologists had long debated its purpose. Some said it was just a retaining wall. Others believed it was part of a fortress. But in the Bible, there's a reference to the Milo, a great supporting structure that David and Solomon fortified. To Mazar, the stepped stone structure and the biblical Milo were one and the same. And if that were true, then the palace would have been built directly above it. Her colleagues dismissed the idea. They warned her she was leaning too heavily on the Bible, allowing faith to cloud judgment, but saw it differently. If we treat the Bible like any other historical document, she once argued it can guide us to where the stones are buried. In 2005, she decided to put her theory to the test. She applied for permission to dig at the top of the stepped stone structure. Many in the archaeological community watched with skepticism, some even with amusement. Could she really find David's palace based on one verse of scripture? Didn't care what they thought. She had her location, she had her team, and she had her conviction. The City of David was about to reveal its secrets. Summer in Jerusalem can be brutal. The air hangs dry, the sun scorches the hills, and the stones themselves radiate heat like ovens. But in 2005, none of that mattered to Aodi Mazar and her team as they broke ground on their most ambitious dig yet. They set up camp on the northern edge of the City of David, just above the great terrace of stones that had puzzled archaeologists for over a century. Mazar believed she was standing on the doorstep of King David's palace. Others scoffed, but she pressed forward. The work was painstaking. Layers of dust, rubble, and centuries of collapsed houses had to be cleared away. Every stone was cataloged, every fragment of pottery carefully brushed and bagged. Archaeology, despite its romantic image, is slow and exhausting work. Progress came bucket by bucket, and then, as the days turned into weeks, something unexpected began to appear. Beneath the debris, the team uncovered walls. Thick walls, not the kind used for common houses, but walls made from massive well-cut stones. They stretched deep into the hillside, forming the outline of a structure unlike anything ordinary. Even more telling was the pottery they found buried in the soil layers alongside the walls. Archaeologists often date ruins by pottery because styles change over the centuries. The fragments discovered here match the period of the Iron Age around the 10th century BCE, the era traditionally associated with King David. This was no shepherd's village. Whoever had built these walls had resources, power, and access to skilled craftsmen. Still, Mazar knew caution was essential. A grand building alone wasn't proof of David's palace. Jerusalem had been occupied and rebuilt countless times over the centuries. These walls could belong to a later king, or perhaps to a fortress or administrative center. But she felt certain she was closing in on something monumental. The deeper they dug, the larger the structure appeared. And beneath every layer of soil, the story of Jerusalem seemed to whisper back at her, "Keep going." The world of archaeology was watching closely, many hoping to see her fail. But what she unearthed next would silence even her harshest critics, at least for a moment. As excavation continued, the scale of the discovery grew. The walls weren't just thick. They were massive, built from enormous dressed stones, carefully carved and fitted together. Some weighed several tons. This was not the architecture of a village. This was the work of a powerful kingdom. The layout revealed the footprint of a monumental building far larger than anything previously uncovered from this period in Jerusalem. There were signs of a gatehouse and what may have been a defensive tower. The structure dominated the landscape, commanding the ridge above the city of David. Mazar called it the large stone structure. But to her, it was more than just large. It was royal. The craftsmanship, the size, and the strategic location all pointed to a building of immense importance. For the first time, the possibility of a real Davidic palace was no longer fantasy. This was the kind of structure described in 2 Samuel, a palace fit for a king. Pottery fragments provided critical dating evidence. Many belonged to the Iron Age 2A, which scholars place around the 10th century BCE. That was precisely the time when David and Solomon would have ruled. Even skeptics admitted the discovery was extraordinary. But the true weight of the find lay in what it implied. If Jerusalem had buildings of this scale in the 10th century, then it wasn't a mere hilltop village. It was a political and administrative center, the capital of a kingdom that directly challenged the dominant scholarly view that David's reign was a myth or a minor tribal chiefdom exaggerated by later writers. Still, the debate raged. Could this really be David's palace? Or was it another important building from a later time? Critics were quick to point out that without an inscription, the connection remained speculative. But Mazar wasn't done, because just as the walls were impressive, the ground around them held something even more compelling. Objects small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, but powerful enough to shake the world of archaeology. They were seals, bully, pressed with the names of figures pulled straight from a Bible. And with them, the line between scripture and history began to blur. For centuries, archaeologists puzzled over the massive step-stone structure rising like a giant staircase on the slope of the city of David. It seemed less like a building than a colossal retaining wall designed to support the ridge above. But to Mazar, this feature was not just an engineering marvel. It was the biblical millow. The Hebrew word millow means fill, and the Bible records that both.